Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to have a panel session, so I'd invite Silvana Macri to come forward. Silvana's business is Stay Cyber Safe, is dedicated to educating and empowering Australian businesses to protect themselves from cyber security threats. Ladies and gentlemen, Silvana Macri. Our third panel member is Pia Turkanov, who is the Chair of Women in Technology in WA, who among other things is a champion for diversity and equality of women in the technical and related professions. Ladies and gentlemen, Pia Turkanov. And to help me not feel quite so lonely up here, Glenn Murray, Managing Director and Chief Executive of Sapient Cyber, whose unique cyber security solution has gained international attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Murray. I'm now going to move to the chair, and I think, yes, I am working. So welcome panel. Minister, I'd like to start with a question in relation to how the government intends to support industry in the development and innovation in the cyber security area, and what you see of the potential benefits to the broader community.
Mm-hmm. And can I say, if there were prepared questions, I haven't seen them. So in terms of the industry involvement, and we do have a couple of representatives here from Oz Industry, I'm a big supporter of Oz Industry because of the support that they can provide to individual businesses and to help them develop their capacity and basically give them business advice, link them into other areas, where it be into export opportunities potentially through Austrade, go through the various funding models that we have. From an industry perspective, what we are keen to do is look at the opportunities to grow businesses in Australia. So we do have a number of programs that are in place. You touched before on the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund, so applications have actually closed for that. It was significantly oversubscribed. But we are working through a process of support to develop capability that will be largely focused on building skill capability and looking at how we can do technological upgrades to make sure that we can become more competitive in that area. We are very keen to make sure that we are growing the links between industry and researchers. We do that through the likes of the CRC programs, Cooperative Research Centres, where we are probably moving a little bit from the establishment of cooperative research centres that run for a maximum period of 10 years to focus on CRCPs, as they're called, which is Cooperative Research Centre projects, which run generally for a maximum of about 3 years, but are very specifically targeted. That's where we're starting to engage industry and researchers and do that very proactively in some key areas.
Thank you. This is a question for the whole panel. Perhaps each one of you could share with us an example of how you've experienced or seen business transformation through innovation. And I'll start with you, Silvana.
Thanks, Gary. So in my current role, it's really leveraging innovation and what's available to you to be effective and what that means in the bottom line. But I also share, so if I can acknowledge the Minister as well and their government in the two programs that are really successful in Stay Smart Online and the Office of E-Safety Commissioner as well, because they very much support what we do and support business, children and the elderly around cyber. Back to your question, Gary, so the other point too is using innovation. I think the Minister spoke about RPA, so robotics process automation. And that's something that's available to all of us in small business and in enterprise, where you can actually automate and make tasks that are quite tedious, take a lot of your resources' time, are quite mundane, very easily to be an automated process that lets those staff do things that are a bit more challenging for them, and they're more likely to stay with you. So there's the element of cyber, but also the element of using artificial intelligence through robotics process automation.
Thank you. Glenn?
Yeah, innovation is obviously in my industry is key. We work in if you have a think about, a very strange industry in cybersecurity. It's not an industry where you can predict what the customer is going to want in the future. So we're very reliant on what the adversary is going to be doing, or the 16-year-old kid who's trying to impress Apple and downloads 90 gig worth of sensitive files. There's no predictability in what we do. So innovation's key. And so it's about creating that environment where the young minds and the minds of the world can come in and be curious and innovate. What's the next detection technique? What is the next machine learning capability that we need? What is that next role in the future that we need that we don't even know we need it yet? And it's not just about the tech minds. It's not the ones and zeros. It's not everything in our industry. It's, I was speaking to somebody at RSA, which is a national conference in the last couple of weeks, and they said one of the best analysts that they had was someone who was a pianist. Not because the ones and zeros, is because they could detect patterns. So innovation is a wide variety. It's not just, in my mind, it's not just, a new novel thing. It can be a process, a procedure, and it could be technology.
Thanks, Glenn. Pia.
West Australia is in an absolutely fabulous position, and we're seeing innovation across all sectors, and I think that's something we really need to keep in mind. Whether it's agriculture, that is really embracing innovation and technology, and the next generation who come from farming families, looking at their farm in different worlds and starting to solve problems differently, bringing different skill sets to the table, right through to, I think, what our traditional real strength is here is we are very much a resources state. We have some fabulous capability, but now adding and bolting technology onto that makes us a world-leading hub in that automation and in that process of actually digitising knowledge that we've gathered over the last 200 years here.
Thank you. Interesting in terms of your comments, particularly when Glenn said about sometimes it's process and procedures. We've got a fairly sizable workforce and timesheets. Everyone loves timesheets. So we've digitised ours and it's transformed the workforce. It also helps with the back of house activity as well. So Pia, a question for you. The importance of STEM learning and ensuring diversity. Perhaps you could expand a bit on what you see the importance of that is.
How long do we have?
Short, because there's lots of other questions.
Well, I think, Minister Anders, you set the scene brilliantly, and you are an example of STEM role modelling. So we're seeing there's a distinct lack in, it's a talent war. This is not a question around gender. This is not a question around diversity of male, female. This is a question of how much talent can we bring to the table to make our community a better place for the next generation to live, and quite frankly, for us to grow old in. I mean, we all want to have a nice retirement, I suspect. There's a huge gap, and especially in the cyberspace. I mean, in cyber itself, women only represent 11% of the workforce, and in the Asia-Pac area, it's 10%. Now, when we then balance that with the conversation that the projections differ, but on average, 1.5 to 3 million jobs are going to be created in this space in the next 5 to 10 years. Where's that talent coming from, and how do we encourage our girls, our daughters, our nieces, our wives, our partners to reskill, upskill and embrace a career where they can actually utilise STEM skills?
Thank you. I think we've got a pretty good role model this morning as the keynote. And
we do.
I've found in life role models are a very powerful way of moving things forward. Silvana, perhaps you could outline for us the changing perceptions of small business in the cyber security risk to their business. And I recall, and I hope I'm not quoting him too incorrectly, but Craig Valley often talks about it's not if you're going to get done, it's when. Yeah.
And that's all around us, Gary, in terms of, what's happening. We see it, and we see it with ransomware attacks all the time. So in the small to medium enterprise space, you're an easy attack vector. It's easy because you're not generally spending as much money on your infrastructure and your defence mechanisms. But I will talk to, you can safeguard yourself as much as you can technically, and we talk about the zeros and the ones, but it's the grey, okay, it's the people that are very easy to socially engineer, and they do present your biggest attack vector in terms of phishing. which will be an entry point for ransomware, and then it's a slippery slope downhill. So from my perspective with SMEs, don't underestimate the value that your staff have to you, and train them up in terms of their expertise around social engineering, so phishing and things like that, which we take for granted because we see it in all aspects of our life, not just at work but at home. So that would be where I would be saying that's a focus for me.
Thanks for that. Glenn, perhaps you could outline some of the cyber security opportunities that you see, particularly in the area of collaboration. And I guess I learned a lot the other day when we had the roundtable at the city, where we talked about having a regular catch-up, and I thought, maybe they will, maybe they won't. And it was a resounding yes please, and how soon can the next one be?
Yeah, it's interesting. So my background's actually electronic warfare. So, and it's all about, classification, security, everything has a defence clearance and so forth. Coming out of that industry into the cybersecurity industry, kind of had the same feel. And so everything's got a security feel about it as a classification. And a lot of the areas that we look at doesn't really need to have a classification, because what it does is it means that data and information is not shared. And so if you're in a company that has had a cyber attack, you kind of feel like I've got to keep that to myself. And so that sharing of that information, so another company doesn't suffer that same attack, is not there. So collaboration is king in this industry. We're up against adversaries where they're very well organised, they're very well trained, and we're very reactive. So we're behind the 8 ball all the time. So by having continuous events, having roundtables, collaborating with other experts in industry is key to start to create an ecosystem where we can start to get ahead of the game. And I can't stress that enough, is that if you have had a cyber attack, there is ways that you can tell the world without giving away all the ins and outs on how it happened, and any IP that may be there. And so other parts of the industry or other industries can learn from that. So collaboration is key.
Thanks, Glenn. Minister, perhaps you might share with us what you see as some of the challenges and opportunities of your portfolio under the current situation, and particularly in light of the announcements made yesterday about boosting industry.
Look, there's a lot of opportunities for business in Australia. And I believe that the package that was announced and is being announced clearly will have some incentives for businesses, support for businesses. What we need to be very focused on, as I said when I spoke before, is making sure that we are playing to our strengths here. So when I worked with my manufacturers, my large manufacturers, my peak organisations, it's very important for them and for the government that there is widespread support for all industry right across Australia, and as a government we will continue to do that. So yes, we have some key strengths, and that's where we'll probably be looking at using funding levers to grow in those areas. But like with any sort of research, for example, particularly the blue sky research, you don't actually know what you're going to find along the way. And what's important for all of us, and particularly for government, is that we are open to those opportunities as well. So we will continue to provide support for all Australian industries. We understand that there's a very big difference in the support that's needed for small, medium and large businesses. And if you look at the circumstances in which Australia finds itself now, we have businesses that have been affected by drought, then by flood, by bushfires, and now potentially the coronavirus. So if you're a large business, particularly if you're a multinational, you are better placed to sustain those shocks, and you have different access to supply chains than a small business, which often keeps a fairly low inventory, practices just in time to a critical point, and then you've got medium enterprises in the middle. Now, each level if I broadly categorise them as levels, requires different support. Now, we know that small businesses are major employers and that a lot of innovation comes particularly from our small businesses. So what we have looked at as a government is how we are going to support small businesses so that they can become medium-sized enterprises and potentially grow from there if they choose to do so. So this is not you get on the conveyor belt as a startup and then you become effectively a small business and you keep growing. You can jump off that conveyor belt anytime you like and stay exactly where you are, and we need that to happen. We need our startups to become effectively small businesses and consolidate, and we will be focusing on a government at continued support for small business, but also the medium enterprises, which are suffering some difficulties right at the moment.
Minister, do you think maybe there'll be a change in business and industry about just in time? I've watched how people used to hold stock.
Yeah.
They don't now.
Yeah.
We've become so good with the logistics that
Yeah.
you don't hold stock.
Yeah.
But if there's no stock at the other end, there's no logistics required, and then there's no stock. Do you
Yeah.
think we might revisit that?
Look, I think there's going to be a rethink, and there already is, by government and by many businesses about their supply chains, their dependence on one nation in particular to supply the goods, the raw materials that they need. So I think that rethink is already happening. I mean, one of the instances that I think is quite concerning that I'll share with you is that I am hearing stories of businesses that are saying that they have been able to find Australian manufacturers to support their supply chain needs at the current environment. But as soon as China's back on its feet, they will go back to purchasing from China because it's cheaper. Now, I understand that. I don't agree with it, and I don't think it's a smart way for businesses to operate. And I think that having come through the bushfire, the drought, the floods, and now coronavirus, and we will come out the end of this, we've actually got to have a seriously look at what our Australian manufacturing capability needs to be. But that requires support from businesses, because let's be honest, and let's call this, the reason that some of our manufacturing has gone offshore is because it did not get support from Australian and Australian businesses as well. So I think that as businesses start to reflect on what has happened and they start looking at what their models are going to be in the future, I would hope that they look at diversification, and I hope that Australian industry supports each other, looks at where the needs are, and seizes those opportunities.
We might see a revitalisation of the Buy Australia program that we used to have years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our panel, Minister Andrews, Pip Turkinoff, Glenn Murray and Silvana Macri.
Thank you.